session on climate change, adaptation, and impacts. We have, this session runs until 2, but in this morning session we have 4 talks that range from regional to global studies, from Australia to the Caribbean and back again. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, Gretta Pecl, from the University of Tasmania, one of my personal academic heroes. Sorry, Gretta. I'm very excited to hear your talk today. So, okay. Okay, thanks very much. Beth, is this, yep, this is on, okay. So today I'm going to be talking about REDMap, the Range Extension Database and Mapping Project. That's a citizen science project that's been running in Tasmania since 2009 and then nationally since about late 2012 or 13. As many citizen science projects do, it includes a lot of contributions and a lot of help, not only from fishers and divers around the country, but from many, many different scientists around the place as well. So I wanted to acknowledge some of those that have contributed to this national assessment of what REDMap is all about, and some of those are here today and they're underlined there. Very, very briefly, REDMap is about trying to detect those species that are shifting south as our climate warms. So it's like an early detection system for range shifts. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the program, I wanted to do just a really short story about how and why we started REDMap in the first place. So the early part of my career was spent mainly fishing and diving off the east coast of Tasmania and other parts of the east coast of Australia, mainly working on squid, so doing acoustic monitoring and tracking and surveys for squid eggs and lots of fishing. And we started seeing new species turn up. And just to sort of put this timeline into perspective, this was back in the day when your director at the time could come out on fieldwork and bring a nice cold beverage out with him. So clearly we're talking a couple of decades ago, because you kind of wouldn't get away with that now. So this is sort of late 90s, early 2000s. But while this was happening and we're spending a lot of time underwater fishing and diving and seeing quite a few new species turn up, not too many at the start, just a few here and there. And at the same time, we were hearing about recreational fishers reporting seeing more snapper on the north coast of Tasmania. And being an ecologist, I was really interested to know where were these snapper coming from, what were they eating, what habitats were they using, how are they fitting into this ecosystem. And so I put a grant application in to try and look at the connectivity and where these snapper were coming from. And I got told from the funder that there was no evidence of snapper in Tasmania. There was only anecdotal evidence from the recreational fishers, and it really pissed me off that didn't count because it wasn't in a scientific database. And then a few years after that, we started working with some rock lobster fishers, looking at climate change adaptation. And we surveyed those rock lobster fishers, and about 80% of them said that they didn't think climate change existed. But we got those same fishers in a room and said, okay, let's just ditch the climate change idea for a while, but tell me about the changes that you are seeing. And they had a list, as long as your arm, of all the different changes that they were seeing in the environment. So REDMap kind of came about because we were seeing the changes, we were getting frustrated that the recreational fisher information didn't count because it wasn't in a database, and then we had all these commercial fishers and recreational fishers that were seeing changes themselves but didn't have the platform to kind of piece all these together. So we started REDMap, and it's essentially about taking observations and pictures from the community and turning that into data. But before we get into REDMap and what that decadal assessment of all of that information from fishers and divers around the country actually means, I want to talk about range shifts, about those changes in species distribution for a minute. Because when we first started REDMap, we were just kind of ecologically curious. We thought it would be an interesting thing to do, to find out about these new species coming into new areas. We really didn't have any concept at the time about how important, how major, how complicated this whole process of species redistribution actually would be. So let's talk about why range shifts matter in the first place. We know they're important for ecosystem structure and function in some places around the world, for food security. They can affect human health through, diseases shifting around or things that bite us and eat us. People's livelihoods also depend on the species that they find around them. Even feedbacks to the climate system. So we're seeing mangroves and other species that sequester carbon shifting around, and that has a local effect on the climate. And then obviously culture as well is incredibly important. And when you think about why regions and countries have had the odd Barney here and there over the years, it's mainly around resources, territory or religion. And now we have all of our resources shifting around. So I think it's pretty important that we try and figure out what's shifting where and what we can do about that. So range extensions in Australia present both challenges and opportunities. And an example of some of the challenges that we've got, relate to the long-spined sea urchin, that beastie that's moving down the east coast of Australia and into Tasmania and creating rocky urchin barrens. And then some of the things that are opportunities are things like snapper that I mentioned earlier. Moving into Tasmania, there's some people that are incredibly happy about snapper, like this woman in a red map observation that got sent in to us. She's obviously pretty ecstatic about catching a snapper off, I think it was like Kingston or something like that, in Tasmania. But even these opportunities we need to know about. We need to know what's moving and shifting where so that we can manage these so that they stay opportunities. And of course, these shifts are not happening all in a nice kind of neat little line moving down the coastline. They're happening in a highly variable way. So there's a whole lot of influences other than climate change. Just because we have warming waters doesn't mean all those things that usually affect species distributions, like habitat and fishing and pollution and all sorts of other things are not still occurring. It's hard to detect some of these. It's much easier for us to spot, a whale shark or something giant like that cruising down the coast than it is tiny little barnacles or other cryptic kind of species. And ultimately, not all species can shift. Some things will adapt where they are, some things will move and some things will die. And species inherently move at different rates. So it's a pretty complicated pattern. We call range shifts or climate-driven redistribution the fingerprint of climate change, but it's a pretty fuzzy fingerprint. We do know, however, that rates of shifts are linked to rates of warming. And off, Australia, you're probably well aware that the southeast and the southwest of our country are warming very fast, in the top 10% for rates of warming globally. The East Australian current, for example, off our east coast has shifted at least 350 kilometres further south just in 70 years. So that's a pretty massive change that we've had off our east coast. And it's not just those increases in temperature over time. We're also getting heat waves. We had a heat wave event here in our Tasman Sea in 2015, 2016, where the temperature was like 2 and 3 degrees higher than normal for 250 days. And those kinds of heat wave events are now much more likely. So, this particular event was about 50 times more likely under climate change. So lots of warming happening around our country. And in general, around the world, we've got plants and animals in the northern hemisphere moving north, in the southern hemisphere moving south. Things are going deeper in the ocean. But when you look at individual studies occurring around the world, and each one of these bars is a particular study in a particular part of the world, and it shows the proportion of species that are shifting in the direction of climate change. And it's pretty variable. Sometimes they go in, they have a look, and it's almost 90% of things look like they're shifting, and other times it's only 5 or 10%. In Australia, it ranges between about 20 to 85% of where, when we go and look, that's the percentage of things that look like they're shifting where they live as a function of climate change. And globally, it's about 50%. And that totally blows my mind, even though I work on species redistribution, that we are literally living through a redistribution of life on Earth, and half the things on the planet look like they've already shifted as a function of climate. And of course, there's lots of other things happening with climate change as well. But in Australia, we have some pretty massive changes. So just in a few years, we've had changes in the distribution of around 45% of our coastline, so corals, mangroves, seagrasses, kelps. That's a lot of habitat loss that we've had as a function of climate change. So species shifts as a function of climate are losses at the top ends of distributions and then increases at the bottom. So lots of things shifting and changing. And diseases and toxins, I mentioned those earlier as well. So shifts and changes in a whole lot of things happening around our coasts. So in retrospect, I'm kind of glad that a bit over a decade ago, we started REDMAP, the Range Extension Database and Mapping Project. And essentially this is about fishers and divers sending in photos through the website or on an app. And each one of those photos that are sent in are verified by around 80 or 90 different scientists around the country, a lot of which are here today. On our website, we've got a list of around 200 species. The species pages look like this. It's got a map of the existing distribution, and then it says, if you see this thing south of, and it gives a location, then send us in a photo. But people can also send in sightings of anything at all. So if you're out fishing and diving and you see something that you think or know is unusual for that area, you can send it in and we'll send that off to experts to get verified. So REDMAP is about early detection of species that are potentially shifting, but it's also about engagement with the marine community using their own data. And I feel pretty strongly about that objective. It's just as important to us as that early detection and the monitoring is. And so after 10 years of getting photos sent in from fishers and divers all around the country, we've been able to do a national assessment of range shifts around the Australian coastline, and I'll go into that in a minute, but very briefly we've got this national poster, and then for WA, Tassie and New South Wales we've got separate report cards. It includes information from iNaturalist as well as Reef Life Survey, and each one of those programs contributed very different information. And I really want to hammer that point home because lots of people think that we can, just amalgamate programs or do with one or without the other, but there are, reasons for having multiple programs. So 3 different report cards as well, and one thing that we did was we got feedback from the fishers and divers about what these report cards could look like. So we don't just take the information away and then give it back, we're actually getting feedback on these things in the first place. Very briefly, we've got a historical range limit, we get new observations, and then we have a new possible range limit. And then that's assessed with a high, medium or low confidence. There's a whole process behind this, a lot of analysis, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look. You can grab this poster from our stand. I wanted to highlight too, in terms of the engagement, it's been very successful in terms of helping people to understand the impacts of climate change and also on stewardship. So when we go and interview different stakeholder groups, they will say if they see fishers contributing to citizen science programs like REDMAP, that it actually creates the perception that fishers do actually care about the environment as well. So multiple benefits of these citizen science programs. We've been able to use this data in a whole heap of different publications. These are just some of the examples. They range from studies about range shifts through to influences of heat waves and all sorts of different things. And I wanted to just finish up by highlighting a new publication out this morning from Alexia Gabrilandri, who's in the audience there. And this study looked at how these citizen science observations really help in terms of quantifying the distribution of present and prediction of present and future distributions. So you can go and see her talk today as well, coincidentally, at 1 o'clock in room E. And I think that's just a fantastic example to finish on about how all these observations that are coming in can be used for detecting species range shifts, for supplementing other studies, and also in communication and engagement with our marine community. So thank you very much for listening. Come and grab a poster at the RedMap stand, and I'd love to answer any questions at lunchtime. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Greta. Always love these projects that are using citizen science in creative ways. Next up, we have Holly Embke from the USGS. Holly is going to be talking about recreational inland fisheries and their uses in food, following up on, if you were at my talk this morning, following up on that. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you all for coming. As Beth mentioned, this is a follow-on kind of expansion of some of the topics Beth touched on in her talk this morning. And it's a really collaborative project, and so I want to highlight the interdisciplinary team that is a part of this work. So today I'm going to be talking about recreational inland fisheries as a source of food and the potential impacts of climate vulnerability on their nutrition and economic value. So I think everybody here is probably aware that recreational fisheries, but specifically inland fisheries, are these ecosystem service hotspots where they connect people through culture, economies, ecological connections, employment opportunities, and subsistence benefits. But inland waters are transforming and susceptible to many influences given their tight human water-land linkages. So things like habitat degradation and fragmentation locally drive change, whereas global drivers like climate change interact to exacerbate change to result in species shifts, invasive species range shifts, all coming together in this social ecological systems context as these are fisheries. And these recreational fisheries support multiple diverse groups where users have different and sometimes competing needs and desires, where sometimes indigenous communities, angling communities come together on the same landscape, and many emphasize consumption as an important motivation beyond just the leisure value that recreational fisheries offer. And Beth really emphasized this work in her Fuzzy Boundaries piece that she was leading, and so I want to steer everybody towards that if they want to expand upon the kind of cultural subsistence and recreational value of inland recreational fisheries. So for this project, we wanted to really think about quantifying that inland recreational fisheries consumption. And so again, highly interdisciplinary, international group of collaborators responsible for this work, led by myself, Beth, Abby Lynch, and Louisa Wood, to first think about how many recreational fishes are consumed from inland waters and which species dominate this consumption. This data is commonly not really well established in many geographies, given data monitoring and quantification challenges. And so we worked with in kind of a series of different approaches to try to collate as much data as we possibly could to develop this data set. We were able to compile a data set spanning 81 countries, 192 species, to put together 575 individual consumption estimates to highlight species-specific inland recreational fisheries consumption and harvest. I want to emphasize that the sources used for this, for different geographies, were variable. So ideally, we would use peer-reviewed literature where harvest was quantified in a systematic way, but that isn't common in many geographies. And so we relied on gray literature sources where sometimes sources were never even digitized. And so we were able to kind of get our hands on some fresh information, as well as context from local experts, in some cases even speaking to local fishing guides. So what did this data look like? I've pulled out here the top 10 countries in our data set that correspond to a bit over 90% of consumption and harvest. Annually, we find about 4 million fishers participate in inland recreational fisheries around the world, and harvest about 17 million kilograms. And I want to also just mention that there's a lot of regional variability within a given country that is not captured within this data set. In the United States, we have access to state-by-state fisheries harvest data, so we were able to kind of run a case study emphasizing that variability to clearly show that these estimates are not necessarily representative of certain locations within a country, and so that maybe provides an avenue for future research. But if we just look at the top 10 countries, these are shown here, and these are the consumption rates broken out by the families of species contributing to harvest. And the black dots show the FAO global freshwater consumption estimate. So what we find when we compare to these global consumption rates that do not consider recreational fisheries harvest or inland recreational fisheries harvest is that for locations that have really high inland recreational fisheries consumption, these global rates are underestimating the contribution of recreational fisheries to their food supply. So when we think about valuing recreational fisheries as a source of food, estimates like this really go towards helping to put numbers and quantifying that to inform policy and management in the future. Then our kind of next questions within this project were to think about what is the actual nutritional and economic value of this recreational inland fisheries consumption, and how may that value be impacted by climate change. So I'm going to spare you the details a little bit on the methods associated with those analyses, but given time constraints, but if anyone has specific questions, super happy to go into that at a later time. And I'm going to run through a bunch of maps that look a lot like this. So in this one, we're looking at the interaction of nutritional value and economic value, where darker blue colors are, for example, Canada, show countries that have both high nutrition and economic value. And mind you, all of these relationships are dependent on the specific species consumption rates. So these are a function of species harvest and consumption. Whereas countries that are in these pink colors, for example, Belarus, have high nutrition value, but potentially lower economic value for the species that are harvested for consumption. While countries in these lighter blue shades, like India, have potentially low nutrition value for their inland recreational fisheries, but high economic value. So when we want to think about interactions between nutrition and economic for future planning and supporting inland recreational fisheries in the future, analyses and data like this can really provide a foundation for that. Then if we transition to thinking about the interaction between economic value and climate vulnerability, countries in these darker green shades, for example, Canada, have both high economic value and high climate vulnerability for the species that are targeted for their inland recreational fisheries consumption. While countries in the blue shades, like Argentina, have high economic value but low climate vulnerability, so they may be of less concern into the future. While a country like Chile has low economic value for their inland recreational fisheries but very high climate vulnerability, so potentially something to keep an eye on if that is a region or if your country falls in those yellow categories. Then thinking about nutrition value and climate vulnerability, we can also think about those interactions. Countries in the red, again Canada, has high nutrition value and high climate vulnerability. Countries in the pink, like Argentina, high nutrition value but low climate vulnerability. while countries in the yellow, like Chile, low nutrition value, but high climate vulnerability. And again, I just want to emphasize all of these relationships are a function of the specific species that are targeted for consumption. So if we kind of bring it all together and think about the interactions between nutrition, economic value, and then the susceptibility to negative climate impacts in the future, here I'm showing a plot where on the x-axis we have log economic value, and on the y, log nutrition value. And then each dot represents a country. And the color of the dot corresponds to climate vulnerability, with the warmer colors, so yellows to red, corresponding to higher climate vulnerability scores. And we did find a rather kind of positive linear relationship between economic value and nutrition value. So countries with higher economic value in their inland recreational fisheries also had a higher nutrition value. But if we want to think about prioritizing which countries may need support in the future, given concern regarding climate change, we can focus on the kind of upper top right quadrant in this plot, where countries fall kind of above average for both economic value and nutrition value, and then their dots are those warmer colors. So in this, I'm just going to pull out a few here. Many fall in kind of Northern Europe, as well as Canada, but also some other geographies like Morocco seem to fall into this category for these inland recreational fisheries that are going to be highly susceptible to climate vulnerability in the future, but also have really economically and nutritionally important inland recreational fisheries. So those are maybe the geographies that need further climate adaptation and management in the future. So I just want to kind of bring it back to emphasize that these recreational fisheries are diverse, they're changing, and they support these many different users, as Beth kind of touched on earlier. They hold a lot of cultural value, and they're an important source of food. And so if we're not understanding and able to quantify the nutrition, economic, and climate vulnerability of these different inland fisheries, it proposes challenges to providing policy and management recommendations in the future. So I think analyses like this provide a starting point and a foundation to start thinking about how we can best adapt to a changing climate. So with that, thank you, and if you have any other questions, I'm happy to take those.
All right, thank you so much, Holly, for that great summary of some really complex data. Our next speaker is Sepp Haukebo. I hope I pronounced that right. He's from the Environmental Defense Fund, and we'll be talking about a climate vulnerability assessment with a case study in the Caribbean. So welcome, Sepp.
Thank you, Beth, and honored to be speaking with such a panel of powerhouse speakers. Wanted to start out by respectfully acknowledging the traditional stewards of this land, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and the peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I learned yesterday that they have been the stewards for over 40,000 years, not 4,000, but 40,000. Pretty incredible. As Beth mentioned, my name is Sepp Haukebo. I'm with Environmental Defense Fund. We work on a number of issues all over the world. We're a nonprofit based in the US, and today I'll be talking about a CVA that we did on recreational fisheries in the Caribbean. So, quick outline. Today we're going to talk about the importance of predicting vulnerability of species to climate change, why we focused on recreational fisheries, what is a CVA, and what were the results of this study. There's no denying we live in a time of climate emergencies. Most of the excess heat from global warming is absorbed into the oceans, as many of us know, and the oceans continue to warm at an alarming rate. Warmer seas mean more fuel for storms. Warmer seas mean higher sea levels, and warmer seas mean loss of critical ocean habitats. Now, climate change already poses a major threat to tropical ecosystems, including those in the Caribbean. This map shows the predicted loss of marine species under 2 climate change scenarios, and notice that the tropics are the darkest red. Fish stocks are moving toward the poles to escape warming waters, and tropical nations are expected to lose important fishery species and habitats in the coming decades. Now, this slide is black on purpose. We have to ask ourselves, what can be done? Even if today every nation in the world meets its goals to reduce climate pollution, there's still a certain degree of change that's baked in. So first, we have to meet the moment. To make fisheries more resilient to these changes, we need to plan for change, and we need to gather the best information available and use that information now to plan for fisheries that are more sustainable and more resilient. So here I present just a few examples of planning for change. In this first bucket, strengthening protections and diversifying livelihoods away from fishing the most vulnerable species. Under the second bucket, strengthening fisheries management to buffer moderately vulnerable species. And then in this third bucket, focusing on developing livelihoods around the least vulnerable species, or even those species that might even benefit from climate change, as Gretta mentioned in her talk earlier as well. Now, why did we focus on recreational fisheries in this CV? As a lot of us know, recreational fisheries can provide more value from fewer fish, but I stress the caveat on can here because a lot of published research tells us that the deal is really in the details. It's critical to understand if and how local communities are benefiting from recreational fisheries. And it's really important to note, a lot of us fishermen and fisherwomen know this, that recreational fishing relies on high quality fishing, and declines in the availability of fish can degrade the fishing experience. So we need good information on what will happen under climate change to make better plans for the future. And this led us to narrow the scope of our CVA to focus on the recreational flats fishery in the Caribbean. And that's primarily made up of bonefish, tarpon, and permit. And it's incredibly important economically and culturally throughout the region. So we chose these 3 fish as our Tier 1 species. Now there's a number of economic studies throughout the region, but one that's cited most often is in the Bahamas, at least before the pandemic, flats fishing was estimated to provide around $169 million US per year to the Bahamian economy. In Belize, that number was estimated around 56, I've also heard 69 million US per year pre-pandemic. So our first goal for this work was to predict the vulnerability of these flats fish to climate change in the Caribbean. Now, as we started to think about this, we had an idea that it was probably going to be a little bit of a dire outcome. So we thought, what other world-class recreational fisheries might be present or possible in the Caribbean? And that brought us to our Tier 2 species. We wanted to ask, how will climate change impact these other target species? And so we identified our Tier 2 species, which is made up of a group of 6 pelagic species and 6 reef fish species, and this really was our goal too. These are our 6 pelagic species, and these are our 6 reef fish species. I'll note here that we included parrotfish, not because it's a common recreational fishing target in the Caribbean, but because they play such an important role in reef ecosystems. Okay, so I'm going to steal a little bit of Beth's talk earlier. What is a CVA? Well, it's a tool to determine relative vulnerability of a species to climate change. And how do we do that? Well, our methodology was derived from some work in the US by NOAA Fisheries. Hare et al. 2016 was most of our methodology. We developed a simpler version of this tool set through EDF's Fisheries Solutions Center, and that's on our website and can be applied in a number of different instances around the world. This is the basic breakdown, and I won't get any deeper into the math in this presentation, I promise. But we use this equation to outline the basic premise of the tool, which is that the vulnerability of a species to climate change is equal to its exposure to climate change times its sensitivity to climate change. And I'll note Beth included adaptive capacity in hers, but in this methodology, that's rolled into the sensitivity scoring. The exposure references how much climate change a species will experience given its distribution and behavior. So here's the 12 different exposure factors that we looked at. Some factors like sea level rise are very well researched and modeled and are a lot easier to conceptualize and discuss with a range of experts, including guides and fishers. Other factors like oxygen or pH, a little bit harder to discuss and also may have a lot more uncertainty. Now on to the sensitivity. That refers to how sensitive a species will be to climate change. This refers to how likely it is to experience population declines. Now, these are the 12 sensitivity attributes, and as I mentioned, these are the traits that are unique to a species that predict the intrinsic resilience to change. And this is what our CVA process looked like. So we worked with a group of 17 experts from across the region. We worked with them to define the scope, and that's where our Tier 1, Tier 2 species came from. And then we performed a desktop analysis, really pulling information from a number of different sources. And then lastly, we held an expert workshop to help train the experts and kind of bring them along in this journey, but also to start to refine some of the information and the scores that we had assigned during the desktop analysis. Now, my favorite part of this is that we wanted to make sure it wasn't just a bunch of science wonks, right? We wanted to make sure we had guides and we had fishers, local managers, and so our methods really depended on a participatory approach, and that's why we wanted to go with the workshop approach. And so we designed this study with the hope that we could have a number of different sources of knowledge in here. For example, a lot of fishing guides have their PhD on the water, right? They've got years of experience and local knowledge and might have already seen some changes on the water. Gretta gave us another great example of that. Experts like fishery managers and scientists have access to data, technical expertise, and so when we combine all these sources, we can really get the best available knowledge. Now, I know in Australia you guys have Movember. In the US, we've got a March stash, and this was back in my March stash days. But our participatory approach was really centered around this workshop. It happened during the pandemic. We wish we could have had it in person, but it still turned out really, really engaging and really impactful. We had 17 experts from 3 different countries, and it was a 2-day workshop. Here's a list, long list of the collaborators that we worked with on this. And now finally to the results. So these are the scores that we identified for bonefish, tarpon, and permit after our desktop review and before the expert workshop. Note that all 3 species were ranked as high vulnerability in the top right corner of this graph. Now after the workshop, the group, based on the scorings that were revised and based on the discussions, the group actually moved permit down from highly vulnerable to strictly vulnerable. There were a number of scores that we also lowered for tarpon, but based on the logic scoring in this methodology, it still remained in the high vulnerability zone. We didn't get as much time to dive into the Tier 2 species, and there's a lot going on here. But I think the key thing to note is that there's a wide range of vulnerabilities across these species, right? And so when you think back to those 3 strategies of the most vulnerable, the medium vulnerable, and the low vulnerable, and start to think about what are some management strategies, what are some intervention and fishing livelihood strategies that can be taken. There's a number of different ways to start building resilience into these communities that depend on these healthy fisheries. Now, I come back to this because up to this point in the workshop, it was pretty dire consequences, right? You don't want to leave a workshop saying, all right, things are not so great, they're going to be getting worse. We want to ask ourselves, what can we do from here? And so to instill change, we have to be hopeful, realistic, but still hopeful. And if you take nothing else away from today, I want this to stick, that to end this workshop, we really wanted to provide strategies and to adapt and mitigate where possible the impacts from climate change. And a key piece of that was hope. So we broke the groups out into a Bahamas-focused group and a Belize-focused group. And we asked, what are some things that you can do as an individual? What are some things that you hope that you can do within your community? And then what are some things that you hope that the government can do? Again, there's a lot going on here, but a few things that really stood out is the importance of habitat. Habitat, habitat, habitat. We've heard that so many times this week. Restoration and education were other really key pieces that stood out, and these were coming from the guides and from the fishery managers themselves. The case was very similar in Belize. Again, you see the importance of habitat, protection and restoration, and education. And so in summary, I'll just share that the climate is changing rapidly, and we know, especially for tropical fisheries, there's going to be serious impacts. During this CVA, we brought the human element to it. We learned from each other, and we advanced our understanding of these important issues. Another key takeaway for us, but for others, is start planning now. Do this in your home fishery if it hasn't been done. CVAs can be done in a data-rich environment, but they can also be done in a fairly data-poor. Use stories. Use some of the examples we heard from the first day of how do you incorporate these stories more into qualitative and quantitative data. And lastly, start taking actions now. We've heard from so many folks, this isn't 20, 30 years from now. There's a lot of impacts we're already seeing on the water, which means there's also a lot of things that we can be doing to manage those impacts, to make fisheries healthier, but also livelihoods better. And so I'll just end by thanking all the folks that we worked with and thanking everybody here today too.
Thank you so much, Sepp. I love how the climate vulnerability assessments continue to grow and get better, and I love the inclusion of diverse perspectives and the solution finding element that you included in the study, so really awesome. Our last speaker for the session is Andrew Beer from the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development in Western Australia. Is Andrew here? Oh, I'm sorry. There you are. I was like, he disappeared. Okay, so he's going to be speaking about adapting to climate change in Australia's southwest region.
Thanks, Beth. Kaya, welcome and thanks for attending my talk. I'd like to commence by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, but also it's important that excuse me, that I recognise the Noongar Nation of the southwest of WA and the land they call Noongar Budja, on which this fishery operates, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So, yeah, I'm not a climate scientist, I'm an aquaculture specialist and I produce fish in this fishery, and so this is about, I really enjoyed and learned a lot from hearing about this, because I'm thinking, okay, this is a very local situation, it's where the rubber hits the road for us, so let's go. All right, so it's a mouthful, the Southwest Inland Freshwater Fishery, so I'm just going to call it trout fishery. So it's about 120 locations, dams and creeks, rivers, great big section of scrub. Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Where's the laser? Is it? Okay. All right, anyway. So you can see basically these icons indicate where we stock our fish. So it starts about 100 kilometres south of Perth, ends in the Jarrah Scrub around Pemberton. So that's in a latitude between about 32 and 34 degrees south. So it's a low latitude, low altitude fishery. So we're really pushing it. So if you think, LA or Georgia or Lebanon, we're in pretty hot country. So it's constrained by our productive waters and, of course, temperature. So, and it's a relatively small fishery. All right. It's important because although it's relatively small in national or global scale, We've got somewhere around 10,000 people that fish in it, 9,000 or more licensed fishers. And spoiler alert, I'm giving a talk this afternoon at 1:15 about the economic value of this put and take fishery. It's in that vicinity. It's a historic place. We've been producing trout since the 1930s. So 2022 was our 50th anniversary, and the ponds that we use were built in 1952. These were commissioned. So I'm just going to give a very light touch on this because this is about the production system because, excuse me. Yeah, I just want to talk about the outputs of the hatchery mostly and how we went about adjusting, making adaptive changes. But and we need significant change here as well. So there's 12 broodstock ponds, each about 25 cubic metres, 8 broodstock ponds from the 50s, as I mentioned, 4 yearling ponds from the 90s. We run flow through most of the year, but we convert to a modified recirculation through these big blue industrial cooling towers. So that's evaporative. They're installed in the 90s. They offer crude temperature reduction, but I wouldn't call it control. We get about 2 or 3 degrees benefit out of that. So, so change is coming. Well, we're all recognising that it's actually here. But we've also had some major changes within the organisation, and I kicked off 3 years ago in this role. So I'm going to roll off a few pretty grim slides outlining the trends that you're going to be familiar with. But going for a deeper dive into the data and the climate science, preparing for this talk, it's validated our decisions about how we're going to improve our stocking program, and it's made the need for that all the more urgent. So the climate trend in the southwest of WA, it's predicted to become more aggressive as well, and that increase in temperature is important because it's across all seasons, and these extreme events in terms of heat waves are becoming more frequent and more intense. I'm diving into weather here, but what happens is the heat trough pushes off the west coast, drives that hot air straight down through off the capes there of the southwest of WA, and we get a bit of a blast of hot nights. The benefit of producing fish in Pemberton is that it might have a 30-degree day, but we'll usually have quite a cool night, and that gives an opportunity for things to get a bit of relief. So I want to switch to water. I think the main point out of this is about the rate of change. We've had continuous change in trends in terms of our rainfall and stream flows, which I'll go on about a bit later, but basically looking at major changes in hydrology and how quickly these groundwater dependent streams have been impacted. So basically pulling the plug out of the bathtub. Whoops, sorry, went too. So you can see the rainfall trend over time, about 30% since 1970. The decline in southwest WA is faster and larger than anywhere in Australia. So this is a bit complicated insofar as it's looking at, on the right, the annual average rainfall from 2 brackets of time, and in the main figure, the percentage change over time. The take-home is we're trying to operate in that section where it's the red zone. So, streamflow change, we've got major shifts from the historical levels, running about 350 gigs to about half that, shifting in 1975 through 2000, and then this major readjustment, this aggressive shift in about 2000 and again in 2010. So that finally comes down to stream flows in rivers, and Donnelly's one of the key stocking locations for trout in the Curry Forest. About 10% of our fish go into this system, and it's the forest drying out in the summer that's doing a lot of damage to stream flows in the rivers, especially here in the 900mm rainfall belt. So that 2000 change at around 2000 down to about 50,000 megs is significant, and it leads to this. This this chart basically gave me the chills, because it drives all of our, or it explains a lot of our problems that have been emerging since 2000. And then in 2010, climate change in our area hit second gear or third gear, and these once consistently flowing rivers cease. So, you know, pre-2000, you can obviously see it's pretty rare that there'd be 0 flow days, and you know, we've only had 4 0 flow days in the last 20 odd years. So that interaction with temperature, not a good scenario. So this is what it looks like when we went out in February in 2020, and I wanted to get a bit of a picture of where we're stocking fish, what's the likely efficacy of our programs. And this is totally crude. We're not looking at any of the elements. Is water present? If it is, what does it look like? And in this situation, pooling or dry streams obviously aren't going to be very good for aquatic life. And Warren is one of the major rivers in the southwest, and there's multiple rock bars holding these large pools, and similar in the Donnelly and the Blackwood. So we're fortunate that that's the case, but they're still probably difficult for fish over the summertime. So looking at the sites that we went to, so we went back and surveyed over 50 of about our 188 or so sites that we released fry, yearlings and ex-broodstock to. It's a grim picture. So the reality was that we really need to you know, take that granular information and have a negotiation with our key stakeholders in the fishery, and really redesign things. Okay. So basically constructed the matrix of location, and I looked at, you know, the various elements about, you know, what were the field observations at that time, historical observations from anglers to calibrate that and make sure I had it right. These stream observations were the locations where we released the fish. We get recommendations from those advisors, and then basically we went through, formulated this traffic light system, and put a line through lots and lots of locations. So that came up, you know, we came up with this concept of right fish, right place, right time, and that's our mantra. It works as an infill guide for our staff, works in discussions with stakeholders, and it works in our production planning in the aquaculture system. So it's a relatively straightforward message, and it gives us that opportunity to make sure that we've got the right product in, you know, time and space. So the main change was a focus in biomass. So rather than, you know, previously we were talking about, you know, X hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of animals going here or there, I'm bringing that back to what can we functionally produce in the hatchery, how many tonnes of these fish, and ensuring that we get the right specified product so that we can prioritise return to creel. So fry, as I said, we put a line through it in 2020 and again in 2021, and last year we got the big red pen out, and this year we're around about 100,000. So yeah, that aggressive trend really should be able to help us get to a sensible allocation of resource in the hatchery, if nothing else, because has the fishery changed or is it diminished? It's hard to say because we've got both the drying trend, but also if there's refuges, redfin probably are in them as well. So I apologise for the different scales here, but on the left, the locations that we were stocking in pre-2020, and then on the right, the reduced number of locations. And we also identified a couple of other locations that looked like they were good prospects. So I suppose at this time I get to recognise my team, Terry, Chris and Jonty. You know, they do a lot of hard work with me actually dramatically changing the operational model, so credit to them. So in terms of focusing on biomass, instead of putting out tiny fry, let's put some weight into them, grow them in ponds, take them out in the truck rather than bagging them up. That's a work in play. But really the main game is how do we actually grow yearlings to be the most likely to be captured by anglers? And, you know, this is really where the right fish, right place, right time. But that comes with a lot of challenge. So, you know, in the Aussies in the audience would say, well, yearlings ain't yearlings, Sol. So And this is what it looks like. So in the redfin zone on the far left of the screen there, if you're putting fish out under about 180 mil, and I'd argue up, around 200, you're going to get chomped. They're going to be basically disappearing from the place, and that's ineffective. That light green space is an easy released zone, easy to transport. They're a couple of 100 grams, and you can get big numbers out. But again, in these very low productivity systems, you need to be able to make sure that we're hitting that window where you've got the greatest return to creel. And ultimately, those changes seem to be trickling through the system, and we're getting a good outcome. And it's effective, right fish, right place, right time. So basically, instead of having a put and grow and take fishery, we've designed a put and take fishery, and I actively encourage people to remove fish rather than release them if they're legal to do so. So they recruit in the season as we put them out as catchables, and we grow them, on aquaculture feeds. And I think that there's an environmental benefit in doing that, because getting into the aquaculture space, I don't think food conversion ratios have been talked about here, but basically, trout grows at a global average of about 1.25, so 1.25 kilos of food goes in, a kilo of trout comes out. But in the wild, it's unknown, but it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 4. So, on that scenario, you need to eat a lot of wild food, insects, other fish, other tadpoles, God knows what else is out there. And they're opportunists, but it's unreliable in supply and duration. And you're really looking at how do you make sure that the animals that you're putting out are going to be in a safe nutritional space. But there's a trade-off. These fish may be considered less wild, but they're better than disappearing post-release animals that are under that size. All right. And so in order to be able to do that, you need a big investment. So you've got to have a RAS system, a recirculating aquaculture system, for the nursery to take them over the summer to be able to get them to that size as soon as the water temperature comes down. But I also need to be able to have a RAS system to safely hold my broodstock. So that bottom right image is a design for a new broodstock RAS system, and on the left is a new nursery system along against the end of our main ponds. It's a big investment, but ultimately, if we don't do it, we can't reliably produce the outcomes, right fish, right place, right time. To be able to create that effective program and to give us good survival and growth, to give anglers a good experience and value for taxpayers on the supply and demand side. And we just need to keep on maintaining vigilance around, looking at the quality of the systems that we're placing fish in, continue to have the conversation with our stakeholders around what that trade-off is, and trying to use aquaculture technology to optimise the size of release, but also to optimise the economic output of this fishery, because it's completely artificial. We put them in, they're not breeding in that system, and so it's closed off. So it's all about how do we effectively do that. Righto, thank you.
Okay, so 4 wonderful talks. We now have a few minutes where we can bring our speakers up to the front and folks can ask questions if they wish. And someone will be around with a microphone here for potential questions.
Thank you very much for some great talks. One of the real big challenges that we are facing in a lot of our recreational fisheries, and I worked in the NT for a while and seen some of the real damage there, loss of thousands of hectares of freshwater wetland systems, just real tragic. My question's more on the trout one, and we've done, in Victoria, we've had to actually look at some of our fisheries and say, these fisheries are, they're gone. Some of those fisheries are will not survive. So, we've actually transitioned some of those fisheries to native fish fisheries, and I know you don't necessarily have endemic or Indigenous natives over there, but would it be something that you should start transitioning to? Because I think some of those fisheries will disappear within, I don't know, like I assume you've done the numbers, some of them will disappear. Is that something you're considering? Because there seems like an end date on a lot of your trout fisheries.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think you're absolutely right. There's a time-limited opportunity to continue with the salmoniid fishery. Certainly in the rivers, I put up there we were making a fighting retreat to the dams, and we'll hold that bastion for as long as we can, while there's the other policy and translocation skirmish around being able to legally introduce golden perch, silver perch. There's big calls for Murray cod and the like. There's a lot of angler interest in being able to do that, and we've done some of that work, and we continue to do that because we recognise that a viable alternative to salmonids for a fishery that currently has around 10,000 people and $40 million worth of regional value is worth being able to do that. And also, this fishery is also. We coexist with redfin and with, we don't need to coexist with cobbler, so a freshwater catfish, but otherwise it'll basically just be the redfin left if we don't have an alternative. So there is, there is appetite for that, to at least look at how we might make that work, what that might look like.
Thanks everyone for those talks. They were really, really great and insightful, and I enjoyed them. Gretta, this one is for you. But firstly, I just wanted to say that RedMap Citizen Science Project is just absolutely incredible, and really wanted for some time to start a similar thing in South Africa. But what I really wanted to know about it is how do you uncouple the effects of exploitation from what you're actually seeing in shifts? So if you look at historically, before there was very heavy exploitation, you generally tended to have broader distributions of fishes, and then fish generally just tend to disappear on their extreme distributional ranges because their abundances are generally lower. And so later on, if you have historical distribution records and then you compare it with contemporary, you might be maybe misinformed to think that actually it's a distributional shift, but it's actually a result of exploitation on the extremes. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's kind of part of what I was getting at too on one of the slides where I was showing how complicated it can be. Exploitation obviously plays a role. Even population abundance that might not have anything to do with exploitation. And snapper in Tasmania, for example, we may have always gotten 0.001% of the population, and if that abundance goes up, then maybe that could be what we're seeing, around Tasmania. It could simply be related with that. However, we have been investigating a lot of these shifts through species distribution models and habitat availability models, and really it's a numbers game. A lot of these species are not subject to exploitation. They may still have those changes in abundance that I talked about. So really looking at one individual shift, it is often difficult to go in and say that particular shift is absolutely a function of climate change. But when you have so many things shifting around all at once, 90% of them in the direction of climate, then it becomes a bit clearer to kind of say, okay, well, the vast majority of those things are probably shifting as a function of the ocean warming up. And I guess other parts of the world where those changes are occurring, not just north and south, but in the direction of the warming. It's not straight north and south. They're getting all sorts of patterns of warming, and the shifts are following those.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Any other questions? Yep.
Um, my name is Rocky Stephen. I'm from the Torres Strait. I guess I enjoyed that presentation from you, brother. You're on the end there. I think you really opened my eyes about what climate change is happening really quickly, and about the tropical fisheries, and especially where we come from. I guess that's a question I want to ask. How soon do you see these changes happening? I know it's happening now, because for us coming to this this conference here has really opened our eyes to see there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the region, in Torres Strait, in protecting our traditional fisheries. And I've seen what you've highlighted, the different species and all that. So I guess to know the time frame, I guess, for me now to go back, because I sit in the TSRA board, and what we need to do now to start putting things in place. How do you see, because I know the effect will start from the north down, and I think what's going to happen, I'm not a scientist or whatever, but I just picked up on your presentation. What's going to happen on the top is going to move down. And I picked up on some of the other presentation by that brother. Aquaculture is possibly another way that we need to look at. I was seeing your presentation, growing stuff and then releasing it back into. So I guess I just need, I'm very open. I want to meet more and have conversation with all of you, because of Torres Strait sits in between Papua New Guinea and Australia. And I can see your presentation made so very much sense about affecting tropical fisheries, you know, and it's the climate up there is so hot. So I guess the time frame and that you see that it's been an eye-opening with this conference for us to go back now and look at what needs to be done and really try and get the government to look into, because for us, recreational fishing does mean traditional fishing for us. It's our traditional, as Stan Louis has mentioned, it's eating. We live on it every day. So I enjoyed all presentation. I love the presentation, what you guys shared here. And I guess it's for me now to, what are the time frame we're looking at so that for us to start preparing? I know we should be preparing 10 years ago, not now. But thank you. And I loved all your presentation. It's been really good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, what do they say? The best time to start saving for retirement is 50 years ago. But I think in terms of timeline, well, I'll back up. One message that I want to share with everybody is that the CVA process does not have to be incredibly complex. And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to bring the guides and the local fishery managers and even politicians along in this journey, is to say, we didn't want to just deliver a report and say, here are our findings. We wanted everybody to be at the table to say, why are these fisheries important to you? What changes are you already seeing? Here's what some of the science is saying. And one of the strategies that we actually identified at the end of that work is more research needs to be done on a few key aspects. And that was helpful for some of the fishery managers who have some funds or work with other NGOs or research groups to say, we know there's a data gap and we want to be prepared for what's coming. Let's prioritize that sort of research. I think the timeline for individual species and the impacts for certain species is going to vary widely. In the U.S., we're seeing mahi off of Alaska, which hasn't been regularly off of Alaska, which hasn't been seen like that ever before. In some areas, the fish are shifting. In the northern hemisphere, things are headed towards the poles, but also fish are headed. Some species are headed deeper. Some species are going to do much better, right? And so it's not all about loss. There may be some opportunities. And so I suggest, I would love to catch up with you after this, but sit down and identify what are those priority species, who are some experts you can invite to the table, but also bring that traditional knowledge, bring some of the decision makers so that they can come along that journey with you. And it's a little bit of inception, right? Like you want to come to a shared agreement of the things that are going to happen and some of the things that you can do as a community, as an individual, or the government can do to mitigate those impacts.
And I'd just add too that the vulnerability assessment process that you presented has actually been done in Australia for about 100 species around the country, and it was used as the basis for the American one to build off, actually. But some of those species from Queensland are in common with the Torres Strait islands there. And CSIRO has got at least some work looking at climate vulnerability for fisheries there, so I can try and put you in contact with some of that work. And I was wondering about links with nutrition as well, that might be something that would be of interest.
Yeah, and I would expand upon that and just say that I think linking into and kind of assessing the nutritional, like from a prioritization structure of, are you prioritize which species are those that you want to protect most to fuel the nutritional value of the fisheries that you want to support, I think, is probably, and then are those the ones that align with climate vulnerability, and are there kind of adaptation measures you can put in place to support those really nutritionally valuable species or culturally valuable species into the future. So kind of combining, nutrition and climate and culture and climate vulnerability, I think, is to think about the adaptation measures. And I think stocking is that would be a potential adaptation measure, but there's certainly other ones out there, other options and adaptation measures that exist that as kind of a local community and local governments ideally would work together to figure out the adaptation measures to support the species that are of most importance for local communities.
And yeah, the role of aquaculture, maybe not so much in the marine space, but in certainly, as you say, stocking and being able to be part of that, nutritional vulnerability space. And the genetics of operations like ours that are pretty much right on the edge of the envelope, we're having informal conversations with researchers in Turkey. Rainbow trout are one of the most widely grown fish as just an artisanal operation in, say, Pakistan or in the subcontinent, other places around the world. So it's important as a food fish in villages, for that purpose. So our animals happen to be, over successive generations, have thermal tolerance, at least 20% higher than the ancestral stocks in the North Pacific. So, we may, through aquaculture generally, and this is a case study, be able to support some of those hotspots of nutritional vulnerability that you highlighted.
Okay, are there any other questions? No, we might wrap it up then, but I was just thinking that is what this conference is all about and why it's so important to take it all around the world regularly and share that knowledge. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. I think that's it. Round of applause for our panel, maybe. Yeah. And I believe there's going to be a how to catch a Murray cod presentation done in here over the lunch break, so we might pop the doors open and let that go. Thanks, everyone.